In 1557, King Philip II of Spain declared bankruptcy. His empire stretched across South America, Central America, and large parts of Europe. His treasury was receiving more silver than any government in history had ever seen, and he still could not pay his debts. He would do it again in 1575, then in 1596, then in 1607, 1627, and 1647. 6 sovereign defaults in 90 years, all while controlling the world's richest silver mines. Few paradoxes in economic history are as stark as that one. Welcome to Financial Origins, where we trace the real roots of wealth, power, and collapse. The story of how empires fall is almost never told by their generals. It is told by their accountants. To understand how Spain got there, you need to go back to 1545. That year, Spanish explorers found Cerro Rico, the mountain at Potosi, in present-day Bolivia. It turned out to be one of the richest silver deposits ever encountered on Earth. Over the following century, Spanish operations in the Americas came to dominate global silver production by a wide margin, with output reaching a scale that had no precedent in recorded history. Entire fleets, the famous treasure fleets, the Flota de Indias, made the Atlantic crossing carrying this wealth back to Seville. This should have made Spain the most financially secure state in the world. Instead, it set off a slow, economic unraveling. The problem was structural. A large share of the incoming silver did not stay inside Spain long enough to build a productive economy. It moved, often quickly, toward foreign creditors. The Habsburgs, the royal dynasty ruling Spain, were almost continuously at war. The Italian Wars, the campaigns in the Low Countries, the conflicts with France and the Ottoman Empire. These commitments were expensive, and military spending in the Netherlands alone across the second half of the 16th century consumed resources at a rate that consistently outpaced the silver arriving from America. So Spain borrowed. It issued financial instruments called juros, essentially government bonds sold to domestic and foreign investors. It borrowed from Genoese banking houses and from German merchant dynasties like the Fuggers. And when the silver arrived, rather than being channeled into infrastructure, domestic industry, or agriculture, much of it was used to service existing obligations and fund the next campaign. Meanwhile, all that silver flowing into European markets was pushing prices upward across the continent. Historians refer to this as the price revolution of the 16th century. Spanish goods became comparatively expensive, which hurt domestic manufacturers. Local industry lost ground. Over time, Spain evolved into an economy that extracted wealth from its colonies and passed it onward, rather than one that built productive capacity at home. Economists today identify this kind of dynamic as a form of what they call the resource curse, the counterintuitive process by which an abundance of natural wealth can erode rather than strengthen the economic foundations of the state that holds it. By the time Philip II reached his second default in 1575, the underlying pattern was established. The crown had come to depend on silver flows as a substitute for fiscal discipline, and the more it borrowed against future shipments, the more those shipments were already spoken for before they arrived. Each renegotiation with creditors bought time, but deepened the dependency. Spain's story is striking precisely because the wealth was real and measurable. Rome's version of the same problem was quieter, and in some ways more instructive, because what Rome lost was not resource income, but something harder to recover, the credibility of its own money. The Roman denarius, sometime around the reign of Nero in the mid-1st century AD, contained somewhere in the range of 90% silver, already somewhat reduced from earlier standards, but still a trusted and widely accepted coin. What followed was a gradual, deliberate erosion. By around 200 AD, estimates of silver content in surviving coins cluster around 50%, though figures vary depending on the sample and methodology. By the crisis-ridden 3rd century, that figure had fallen dramatically. Some numismatic analyses suggest it reached single digits in certain issues. The coin still looked like a coin. It still bore the emperor's face. But it had become, in practical terms, a copper token with a thin silver wash. The Roman government was making this choice under pressure. Military commitments had grown beyond what ordinary taxation could reliably fund. Emperors faced constant threats from external adversaries and internal challengers. The legions needed to be paid regularly, and additional bonuses, called donatives, were often distributed to secure loyalty during transitions of power. Rather than raise taxes to politically dangerous levels or accept the risks of cutting military spending, successive emperors found it easier to debase the coinage, melt down old coins, alloy and cheaper metals, mint more. What followed was predictable to anyone who watched the markets. People who handled coins regularly noticed the change. There is documented evidence in papyri and other sources of merchants beginning to distinguish between older, higher quality coins and newer debased issues, holding on to the former and spending the latter as quickly as possible. This pattern, where lower quality money tends to displace higher quality money in everyday circulation, is well known to economic historians and has been observed across many different periods and cultures. It tends to accelerate transactions rather than slow them, which adds further upward pressure on prices. The price inflation that followed was not a single event. It accumulated over generations. By the time Diocletian attempted a fix in 301 AD, issuing his edict on maximum prices, one of the most ambitious price control efforts in ancient history, the underlying monetary damage was already severe. The edict set caps on hundreds of goods and services across the empire, from grain to the wages of a farm laborer or a lawyer. It failed quickly. Sellers withdrew goods rather than sell at a mandated loss. Exchange moved to informal arrangements outside the official economy. The edict was abandoned without achieving its goals. What Rome lost through currency debasement was not just purchasing power. It was the institutional trust that a functioning monetary system depends on. The confidence that the money in your hand will be worth approximately the same amount tomorrow as it is today. Once that confidence erodes, it is not easily rebuilt by decree. France arrived at its version of this crisis through a different path, one defined not by monetary manipulation, but by the slow accumulation of debt and the political impossibility of distributing its costs fairly. By the late 1780s, the French crown was not facing a temporary cash shortfall. It was facing a structural fiscal trap that had been tightening for decades. Successive wars, including the 7 Years' War, which France lost heavily, and then the decision to support the American Revolutionary cause, had driven borrowing to a level where a substantial portion of royal revenue was committed to debt service before it could be used for anything else. Contemporary estimates, including figures discussed in official royal accounts of the period, suggested that somewhere close to half of annual expenditures were going toward interest payments rather than governance. The tax system offered no easy escape. French nobility and clergy held legal exemptions from direct taxation that dated back centuries and were defended with considerable political force. Reform proposals put forward by successive finance ministers, including Turgot, Necker, and Calonne, were blocked or diluted by the privileged classes who had the most to lose from change. The burden of funding the state fell disproportionately on those with the least capacity to bear it and the least ability to resist. When Louis XVI finally convened the Estates General in May 1789, the first time the body had assembled since 1614, it was a last attempt to resolve a fiscal crisis through political consensus. The assembly that gathered to negotiate a budget solution instead became the starting point for a revolution that reshaped the entire social and political order of the country. 3 cases. 3 empires or great powers. 3 different mechanisms of fiscal failure. And yet, when you set them alongside each other, the underlying structure is strikingly similar. A state accumulates commitments that exceed what sustainable revenue can cover. It reaches for a short-term instrument. Borrowed silver, debased coin, borrowed money on unfair terms, to close the gap. That instrument works for a while, which reinforces its use. Over time, it stops working, and the accumulated imbalances surface in a crisis that is harder to manage than the original problem would have been. That pattern, not as metaphor, but as a documented feature of how states under fiscal pressure tend to behave, is the thread connecting these 3 cases to dozens of others. If this kind of analysis is what brings you to this channel, subscribe to Financial Origins and give this video a like. It helps us keep building this archive. The same dynamic appears in contexts far removed from Europe. The Ming dynasty in China faced a severe fiscal and monetary crisis in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Part of what destabilized it was, paradoxically, connected to the same Spanish silver economy. A large influx of New World silver into Chinese markets disrupted domestic monetary conditions in ways the government struggled to manage. The Ottoman Empire underwent extended currency debasement across the 17th and 18th centuries, as military spending increasingly outpaced what the tax base could sustain. Even the British government, which accumulated significant debt during the Napoleonic Wars, navigated the situation differently, not because the pressures were absent, but because relatively strong institutions, an established central bank, and deep capital markets provided tools for managing and gradually reducing the burden over subsequent decades. What makes this pattern so persistent is not that those in charge fail to recognize it. The historical record suggests they often recognize it quite well. Philip II's financial advisors understood the structural problem with silver dependency. Economists and officials around Diocletian understood that debasing the coinage had consequences. The French finance ministers of the 1770s and 1780s produced sophisticated analyses of why the fiscal situation was unsustainable. The gap is not usually in the diagnosis, it is in the political calculus of correction. Every available remedy, raising taxes, cutting military spending, breaking the privileges of powerful groups, carries immediate costs and concentrated opposition. The alternative, continuing down the same path, distributes the pain more slowly and more diffusely. For anyone whose time horizon is the next few years rather than the next few decades, the math of delay is often more attractive than the math of reform. That same calculus is not hard to observe in the present. Several major economies today carry public debt as a share of national output at levels that would have been considered extraordinary by earlier historical standards. The specific mechanism of currency manipulation has changed. Modern central banking operates through instruments that have no ancient equivalent, but some of the underlying effects on purchasing power and on the confidence of those who hold savings are recognizable from older patterns. And the structural question of who bears the cost of fiscal imbalance, which groups, which generations, remains as politically charged now as it was in pre-revolutionary France or late imperial Rome. None of this is a forecast. Modern economies have buffers and institutions that Philip II and Diocletian could not have imagined. International financial institutions, lender of last resort mechanisms, transparent bond markets, independent central banks with crisis tools. The comparison between past and present is not meant to predict outcomes. It is meant to help identify the conditions under which outcomes have historically become harder to manage. The Spanish Empire kept operating for well over a century after its first default in 1557. Rome's monetary system eroded across more than 200 years before the Western Empire fragmented. France's fiscal trap had been closing for decades before the Estates General met. None of these were fast-moving crises. They were slow accumulations, punctuated by moments when the underlying stress became impossible to defer. And at most points along the way, the people living through them had more warning than they had will to act on it. That is what gives these cases their lasting relevance. Not the drama of their endings, but the clarity of their trajectories. The warning signs in each case were legible well before they became irreversible. The specific details change with every era. The architecture of the problem tends to stay recognizable. Understanding that architecture is not the same as knowing how a story ends, but it is the closest thing history offers to a second opinion, a way of asking before the last chapter whether the pattern forming in front of you is one you have seen before. If the economics of power is what brings you here, subscribe to Financial Origins, leave a comment with what you found most useful, and hit the like button. The history of where wealth concentrates, where it moves and where it disappears is still unfolding. The chapters that have already closed are the clearest guide we have for reading the ones being written now.